Hello, and thank you all for joining Nature Talks, things that make you go, boo. My name is Evan Baltzer, and I'm a conservation intern for the Manitoba region here at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I'm located in the city of Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, Anish-Ininiwak, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Later, you'll also hear from speakers in other parts of the country. Victoria is in Calgary within Treaty 7, which are the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda, and Tsuut'ina Nations, and homeland to the Métis people, Region 3. Both Toby and Christina are in Toronto, the traditional lands of many nations, including the Huron-Wendat, Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis peoples. Today, this place is also home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. At the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we know that the work we do across the country is on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. As an organization, we are therefore committed to reconciliation, and we do this by seeking Indigenous counsel, listening to, learning from, and collaborating with Indigenous communities in the work that we do. So today, I invite those of you streaming live with us to use the question and comment function and let us know which ancestral lands you find yourselves on. If you're not sure which traditional territory you're on today, one helpful resource you can check out is the Native Land website at www.native-land.ca. So if you want to take a moment then and chime in with where you're from. Good stuff. Thank you, folks, for sharing where you're at. And for those of you who are less familiar with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, so we are a national charity that conserves nature, and our mission here is simple. We protect and restore Canada's most important natural areas and the species that they sustain so that both nature and people can thrive. And since 1962, with the help of our partners and donors, we have protected 14 million hectares, or 35 million acres, of land from coast to coast to coast. And that said, you may be asking yourself, how does a conservation charity fit into Halloween? Well, around this time of year, the movies, costumes, lawn decorations feature visuals ranging from the cute and cuddly all the way to the genuinely creepy, peppered with portrayals of commonly misunderstood and often feared animals. And although legends of bats and vampires, wolves and werewolves do indeed make for great stories, over time, those haunting images have helped to create really negative and often fearful stereotypes. And this fear can complicate the effort then to gather support for the protection and survival of those very species. As a bat biologist myself, I had the unique experience of letting homeowners know that they had endangered bats roosting in their houses upstairs. And often those conversations and the facial expressions that went with them told the story of folks that wanted to do the right thing, but who had been fed all the wrong information about their natural neighbors. Bats, like so many other species, have frequently terrible PR. But today, we're here to offer a different perspective and to share stories of appreciation for these animals and more. And so I'm excited to be sharing the stage then today with speakers that will tackle these negative stereotypes and stigmas. And together they'll help break down some common misconceptions, shed light on the power of perception, and even suggest ways for you and I to treat Halloween differently this year and onwards. And so at this time, I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, Toby Thorne. I first met Toby at a bat research conference, yes, they exist, a few years ago, and I'm excited to be sharing the stage with him today. Now, Toby's fascination with bats started in his homeland of England, eventually leading him to study biology at the University of Oxford, where he examined social relationships among bats. Now, in 2013, his master's program brought him to Canada to investigate bats around the Great Lakes, and since then, he's made Ontario his home, working on various bat conservation programs and even authoring a field guide on the bats of the province. Since 2016, he's been with the Toronto Zoo and is currently the coordinator of the Native Bat Conservation Program. Toby, my friend, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Evan, and it's really great to meet you all and to be here today to tell you a little bit about bats. And You probably all have bats on the mind at the moment because we're a few days away from Halloween, and that's the time when we typically see bats. And the depictions of bats you see, though, are often scary and slightly monstrous creatures, and that's not what bats are like at all. And so what you might not know is that this week, the week leading up to Halloween, is also Bat Week, International Bat Week. And the reason we have this now is to provide a positive balance and perspective on bats to address some of the more negative stories that we're hearing about them. And so today, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about bats and some of the really interesting things about them. And I hope that by the end of my slides, you'll be able to all join me in becoming ambassadors for yourselves and helping to spread positive news and energy about bats this Halloween. So let's start with one of the most common stories and misconceptions and myths about bats, which is their association with vampires and Dracula. Now, I've met a vampire bat. I caught this bat in this picture here in Belize about 8 years ago. And it's true that there are bats that feed on blood. There are 3 species that are true vampires, but there's more than 1,400 different species of bat in total, and most of those aren't vampires. And it's probably everything else that you've learned from movies or cartoons about vampire bats is untrue. And I learned that when I met this bat back in 2013. She was a very interesting animal. She did not turn into a man with a cape and greased back hair. She did not stick fangs into my neck and suck my blood, and she did not sleep in a coffin. And really, the true facts about vampire bats are much more interesting than the stories. So these bats, this is the common vampire bat, Desmodus rotundus, and they feed on mammals. And historically, that would have been jungle mammals. They live in Central America. And now, because we've cut down a lot of the jungle, they feed a lot on cattle and the cattle farms that have replaced it. And so the bat heads up towards an animal that it wants to feed from. And instead of sticking fangs in and sucking its blood, they cut a little divot of skin with those 2 front teeth you can see in the picture, which are incredibly sharp, like a scalpel blade. And it's so sharp that the animal they're feeding from doesn't feel anything. And the bat can lick the blood up with their tongues, much like a kitten feeding on milk. And if I can't convince you on that being a good parallel, there's other things that make them interesting as well. So these bats are very social and they support each other. So if one bat from the colony is unable to feed on a given evening, other bats will regurgitate part of their own blood meals to feed it. But the society around this is incredibly complex because the bats keep track of who participates. And so if one bat refuses to feed another, then if that bat later is unable to feed, the other bats will refuse to feed it. So they have a really complex society tracking these relationships, so they know what's going on. Let's jump a bit further north and a bit closer to home and talk about some Canadian bats. So this is the Hoary bat. It's one of the largest bats in Canada, and it's named for that beautiful silvery grey fur on its back that looks like the hoarfrost, the freezing frost on a foggy morning. And in addition to that grey fur, they have this brilliant big yellow mane around their heads. I guess if you don't think this is a cool looking animal, then you and I have a different taste in what's a cool looking animal. But even if you don't like the look of them, you have to respect that they're fascinating animals. The hoary bat is one of Canada's migratory species. And so in the wintertime, when it gets too cold for them, they travel south into the States and even as far as Mexico to find somewhere comfortable to spend the winter, like some Canadians, I think. And that's a huge distance for a bat this small to travel. I said it's one of Canada's largest, but it only weighs about 30 grams, which is the same as a AA battery. And I don't think I could get anything powered by a AA battery to make it all the way down to Mexico. And then jumping to the other end of the scale, we have one of Canada's smaller bats, the little brown Coyotes. And this is also very widespread. So wherever you live in Canada, unless it's really far north, there are probably little brown Coyotes close to you. And unlike the hoary bat, this bat doesn't migrate. It stays here for the winter, so it has a very different strategy. Instead of traveling south to overwinter, it goes into a cave and finds a sheltered space where it can survive the winter, and it sleeps through like many other hibernating animals. And you can see these bats in this picture here tucked up in a cave cavity in Ontario. And this is a great strategy for the bats because it allows them to be sheltered and protected when there's nothing to eat, and then just wake up in the spring when the insects come back. But little brown Myotis are also one of Canada's endangered bats. They're a federally endangered species added within the past 10 years, and they're facing a really critical decline. And the cause for that is a disease called white nose syndrome. And so white nose is a fungus that grows on the bats when they hibernate. And unfortunately, the same conditions that make a cave great for bats to hibernate in also make it great for this fungus, which was accidentally introduced to North America by humans in 2006 and has spread very rapidly, reaching Ontario in 2011. And the fungus grows on the bats when they come to hibernate. It irritates them, it causes them to wake up out of their hibernation. And because they have limited energy reserves to make it through the winter, the more times they wake up, they use that more quickly. And if there's nothing to eat on, they end up starving. And so white nose has caused around 90% declines in some of the worst affected bat species, of which little brown Myotis is perhaps the most affected. And you might ask why we should care about this, or why bats matter. Why should we worry about losing a species like the little brown Myotis? Well, globally, bats have a really important role in many ecosystems. In tropical countries and jungles, bats are really important for spreading seed and helping plants to spread around and fill in gaps in the jungle. They're also really important pollinators, and there's about 500 species around the world of plants that are pollinated by bats, including the agave plant, which is the plant from which we get tequila. So if you're a fan of tequila, you have to be a fan of bats. And in Canada, there's not quite such a clear headline. We don't grow agave and make tequila here. However, bats are still a really vital part of our ecosystem and a much larger part of it than many people imagine. They make up about 1 in 5 of our mammal species, and they eat a lot of insects in Canada. That's their exclusive food, which contributes to pest control and sort of keeping the ecosystem in balance. So what then can we all do to help bats out? And a really key part of that is giving them a place to call home. So habitat loss is another threat that affects bats. It's not the one that led them to become, led species like little brown Myotis to become endangered species, but it's still a critical issue for them. And what we see with white nose is that although 90% of some of the species have disappeared, that 10% seems to be clinging on. And if they're going to survive and perhaps even recover, they need places to do that in. And so for that, it becomes really important to identify and protect their optimal critical habitat and give them a place to live. And that's one reason why it's really great to do this presentation with NCC, because NCC is an organization which the Toronto Zoo, where I work, has partnered with in order to monitor bats. And in particular, we've been working to learn about the bats in Happy Valley Forest, which is just north of Toronto. And over the past few years, we've identified that this is a significant location for little brown Myotis. And that makes sense because they're a forest-focused species, and Happy Valley Forest is the largest continuous patch of forest in the area. And so by working with partners like NCC, we can identify these sites and make sure that the bats that live there are protected. On a more personal level, you can help bats by just being a friend to them and spreading positive messages about them. So don't let this Halloween be full of negative stories and scary depictions of bats. Take it as an opportunity to tell everyone how cool they are. And I do find that whenever I get to tell people about bats or introduce people to bats, the #1 reaction they have is, oh, it's much cuter than I was expecting. And we don't get to show everyone a bat in person, but I think we can at least let them know enough to have better expectations than whatever monster they thought they were going to meet. And so I hope with this that you will help us to keep bats on the map. At this point, we're trying to fill a lot of knowledge gaps about bats, and there's many things we just don't know. So we're trying to fill the map in just as bats are disappearing off it. And so as well as just spreading positive messages about bats, you can also engage in community science projects, and particularly the neighborhood bat watch, where you can report bats in your local area, particularly if you know of a bat roost location. So you can go to batwatch.ca and report that roost location, which can help you connect with bat researchers who'd be able to use that to further study the bats. And you can also learn more on our own bat program website at torontozoo.ca/bats. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, thanks so much, Toby. I have to say, my own research here in Canada was massively improved through the help of folks that shared knowledge about local bat roosts. So I really couldn't agree more about how helpful the public participation in wildlife monitoring can be. Thanks also for highlighting so many other reasons why we should adore bats rather than fear them. Personally, I will go forward referring to myself as an ambassador. And with that pun, we'll move on to our next speaker today, Dr. Victoria Lukasic. Victoria has studied a variety of species, from burrowing owls, a childhood favorite of mine, to leopard frogs, also a childhood favorite of mine. Her master's work was focused on urban coyotes in Calgary, and her doctorate focused on carnivore management practices across Western Canada. Her research interests focused on the human dimension of wildlife management and conservation, including human and wildlife interactions, and lessening the impact we humans have on wildlife and their habitats. Currently, she is a wildlife biologist with Western Ecosystems Technology, also known as WEST, and is also a sessional instructor at the University of Calgary. Whenever you're ready, take it away, Victoria.
Thank you, Evan. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk on who's afraid of the big bad wolf. So first of all, what is a wolf? Is it a vicious, bloodthirsty beast, something that might take down any animal in the area or any human even, or even a monster? And of course, we have that top of mind at this time of year, the werewolves and the scary man-eating beasts. Or are they just simply dogs? We have a lot of different opinions that we have of these animals, and coyotes are also one of the animals that we wonder about a lot and perhaps see a lot more than a wolf. Are coyotes just urban wolves? So throughout history, we've had stories about wolves and other carnivores, but wolves are especially popular. We often think of this idea of the big bad wolf. The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a well-known story. And werewolves have been around since ancient times. In fact, in ancient Greece, there was a story about Zeus turning someone into a werewolf as punishment. So we've been with these stories for a long, long time, and we use them in our stories today. It's an easy way for films and books to create drama. We see it even when we retell a story. For instance, The New Beauty and the Beast continue to have that vicious wolf attack scene. But we also have real wolf stories, thankfully. Scientists have been researching wolves for decades and decades. In fact, many people say that the wolf is the most researched animal of all of them, at least of all wild animals. And so we actually know a lot. These are just some examples of stories that you can find that are real stories about wolves written by the scientists, photographers, and other researchers who have observed them for many years. So let's talk a little bit about some of this myth breaking. So wolves do howl, of course, and we may love this picture of them howling with the background of a full moon, but they're not really howling at the moon, and they're not transforming or doing anything in relation to the moon. They're simply howling as a form of communication. They communicate between pack members, so one wolf to another, and they also communicate from one pack to another pack. So this can help them find each other, coordinate hunts potentially, even sort of celebrate, as well as warn other packs to sort of stay out of their territory. They're also not killing machines. So wolves are known to be successful in chases only about 30% of the time, and in some areas they found them as successful in as little as about 3% of the time. So it really takes a lot of energy and effort for a wolf to make a kill. So some of these ideas that people have of wolves sort of eating up all the prey, or killing something just for the fun of it, doesn't really make a lot of sense. These animals are hunting prey that are much bigger than them, and they frequently get kicked in the ribs or the head. Researchers who found dead wolves have found all kinds of broken bones that have sort of healed, and somehow they've survived this. So they're very careful, and they kill to eat, not just for fun. When we're talking about coyotes, they're not just out there to kill all the cats in the neighborhood. So if you live in an area with coyotes and you see posters with cats missing, I mean, the thought that I've heard from so many people is, oh, it must be the coyotes who got them. But there are a lot of risks to cats in an urban environment. And coyotes actually much prefer eating mice and voles and the little rodents that we actually tend to not like having around, ground squirrels. And strangely enough, they also like eating a lot of vegetation. So this is some data from my research, my master's degree, where we found that they really depend mostly on small mammals, even more so than rabbits, where in Calgary we expect them to have a lot of rabbits since there are so many. Another interesting thing is coyotes have been observed to even be able to climb up into trees. So here it's hard to see maybe, but there's a little bit of leftover crab apples on the top tips of these branches in the wintertime when there's not a lot of other food available. And well, they are very ingenious and really try to get out there and get that food. These animals also help regulate ecosystems. So there's a really well-known long-term study that's happened in the Yellowstone, and people eradicated wolves from there for a long time, almost a century, and then wolves were reintroduced, and it was really remarkable, the change of the ecosystem. They not just only hunted prey, and therefore reduced populations, but they also changed the behavior back to that natural behavior where animals like elk are moving around a lot more and not overgrazing, and that had implications down to the river being healthier. They also don't kill all the livestock that you would think from what the kinds of things that we hear from those sort of interest groups. So usually it's about maybe up to 3 to 5% of all the sheep or all the cattle in an area that ever get killed or injured by these carnivores. And by carnivores, we're talking not just wolves, we're also talking bears and cougars and coyotes. This is a similar percentage to how many are killed through poisoning, self-poisoning by eating the wrong plants, through birth problems, weather, health, things like that. So it is a small percentage compared to what we would think from what we hear. And the sad truth is that it's us who are the killers, really, right? These different wolf stories, they may be fun for us to hear, but we have to really be a little bit careful about promoting this big bad wolf ideology, because some people do buy into it. They think wolves are sort of evil, they're these killers, and the only thing that we can do is to kill them. And killing wolves is really ineffective. Wolves and coyotes too, they're actually quite successful at reproducing, and so you just end up having this system where you kill them off, they come in, you kill them off, they come in, and if you have animals there that aren't killing your cattle or killing your cats or things like that, if they haven't been taught to look for human sources of food, then it's best to leave them be on the landscape, and they will sort of defend their territory from any others who might otherwise come in. So what can you do to help? Well, one thing is try to share some of the better wolf stories, right? We have a number of stories that are out, from White Fang to Never Cry Wolf, and to some funny contemporary sort of almost satire ones that kind of poke fun at the big bad wolf image. So maybe take a look at some of those for just a different telling of that wolf story. Some other things that you can do, and even if you live in the city, you might have coyotes around, or any other wildlife really, raccoons, skunks, especially bears, obviously, if you live in bear country, but treat any animal the way you would treat a bear. Don't feed them, because whenever you feed them, you're starting to get them to depend on you, and you're starting to see them associate people with an easy source of food. And that's what ends up leading to that behavior that can become dangerous. And that's what almost always ends up leading to somebody killing that animal for the protection of people or pets. So don't feed them. Make sure you're not unintentionally feeding them with your garbage or compost or things like that. And give them space. If you see one, well, what a treat. But back away. Don't crowd them. Don't force them into a situation where they're afraid and might become aggressive to try to protect themselves. Another thing is that these animals are not protected by law in most cases. Wolves and coyotes are not considered endangered in most parts of Canada, with a few little exceptions. And so, you know, tell your political leaders, whether it's your city councillor or your MP, that you don't support lethal carnivore management. So remember, they belong here too. When we think they don't belong here, we usually shoot them even if they haven't done anything wrong besides being in the wrong place. So keep that in mind. And I'd like to thank you all very, very much for your time, and I'd be happy to discuss any of this further.
Thank you, Victoria. You know, just the other day, I actually heard a story about urban coyotes making off with cats just near my parents' place here in the heart of Winnipeg. And so I'm glad to now have some context for all those tall tales. And furthermore, I'm also thankful to have more reasons to appreciate both wolves and coyotes alike. So thanks for helping to change the narrative and for shining a light on how important these species are. And as we move forward to our last speaker today, keep in mind some of those adult created narratives within childhood stories, as we hear from Christina Ingraldi. Christina comes to us with a master's degree in primatology and nearly a decade in fundraising experience for nature-based causes. In her role as the Director of Development at EarthRangers, she leads the Wildlife Adoptions Program, which connects their member base of over 300,000 youth with urgent species conservation projects and partners. Through that program, youth get to meet experts and interact directly with the species issues and solutions that they care about most. And now, spoiler alert, if anyone joining us today has a serious aversion or phobia to eight-legged species, the following talk may be best heard rather than watched for you. And now, take it away, Christina.
Thanks so much, Evan, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm Christina, Director of Development at EarthRangers, and I'm going to be talking to you today about big bad wolves and climate catastrophes, how we address children's fears through positive learning. So just a quick overview of our organization and what we're all about. For those who haven't heard of us, we are the Kids Conservation Organization, started in 2004 and born of the fact that all kids, no matter who they are or where they come from, have this inherent love for animals and for nature and want to protect them. So we give them the tools to do just that, not only by imparting environmental knowledge and a foundation of understanding for today's environmental issues, but also helping them to approach those issues with positivity and confidence that they can affect real change. So this positive approach is what I want to talk to you about today, and especially as it relates to children's fears and how we can help them overcome and process those fears. So let's start with what I'll call irrational fear, defined as something that we fear despite knowing that it's not at all dangerous. So things like fear of flying, going to the dentist, clown can all fall into this category. For kids, those fears are even more numerous, like fear of the dark, monsters under the bed, or if you're like my 3-year-old getting sucked down with the drain with the bathwater. But probably the most common irrational fear, and we mostly see it in adults, is the things we think of as creepy crawly or ferocious or dangerous animals. And while I'm not going to pretend that animals can't be dangerous, and there is some evolutionary basis for a fear of spiders and snakes, a lot of these fears we have are really unfounded, especially here in Canada. But the fears endure, and more often than not, they're passed down to our kids as they see us react to these creatures or see them villainized on TV or in stories. So here's just a few examples of common animals that people fear, from bats flying into your hair to sharks coming up from the deep to swallow you whole. But probably the most common fear that people have is of spiders. So now is maybe a good time as any to introduce my special guest. If you'll give me a moment. Okay. So I hope everyone can see that. This is my girl Sheila. She's a Chilean rose tarantula, and she's been part of my family for 17 years. She's a particularly calm and docile species found in the Atacama Desert region of Chile. Like all spiders, she does have venom to immobilize her prey, which in our house is mostly just crickets, but she's not dangerous to humans. In fact, less than 30 of the approximately 47,600 known spider species pose any threat to human health. So that's not very many. But if you're like around 1 in 4 Canadians, you might recoil in fear at dear old Sheila or at any spider, regardless of whether they're a hairy tarantula or a little house spider. You want to wave hello? So I didn't just bring Sheila out to show her off, although I do love doing that. She's also a living example of learned versus innate fear. It's overwhelmingly the adult visitors to our house who are terrified of her. My aforementioned daughter, who is 3, grew up with the tarantula in the house and thinks nothing of it. And other kids who visit invariably react to her with excitement and curiosity and not fear. And that's the innate reaction from children who haven't learned otherwise. So I'm going to put her away. Hi, Sheila. All right, so at EarthRangers, we frequently leverage this curiosity and wonder that kids have of things that are traditionally looked at as creepy crawly or weird or, you know, just ugly. And we teach kids that all species are important and have a crucial role to play in the ecosystem and even in the lives of humans. So for example, if we didn't have spiders, the planet would face famine as they're the primary predator of crop-eating pests. Snakes help keep rodent populations under control. Bats voraciously consume mosquitoes. We teach kids about the importance of these species in terms that they can understand, and we bring this learning to life with really fun and engaging content like funny animal videos, top 10 lists on our blog, wild and wacky segments on our podcast, and just cute creature-related activities. And it's really effective. Just as one example, our members have raised over $215,000 to help little brown bats through their own creative fundraising efforts. We've done campaigns around wolves, salamanders. We currently have a wildlife adoption program for the eastern milk snake. What we hope is that we're instilling in these kids that all organisms deserve respect and advocacy no matter how they look. There's another kind of fear that our organization has found itself having to address among our members, and this one is much more rational. Fear of a real imminent threat that has become increasingly pervasive in our 6 to 12 age demographic. And that threat is climate change and environmental degradation. Children today are inundated with news of burning forests, flooding cities, melting ice caps, species going extinct, the ever-looming threat of climate change. These things can culminate to paint a picture of a bleak future for kids, and they can also be really overwhelming, and it's starting to show. In fact, there is a term for it, and it's called eco-anxiety. So eco-anxiety we define as worries about the future of the Earth and a feeling of helplessness over the potential consequences of environmental perils, especially climate change. So upon seeing this phenomenon growing, EarthRangers decided to undertake a comprehensive research study. We did it in partnership with Ipsos Canada and climate change and mental health experts. And our goal was to capture the attitudes and actions around environmental issues by kids and their parents. So this research included an in-depth literature review and a survey among not only EarthRangers members and non-members, but their parents too. You can find the full white paper with our methodology and results on our website, but I can summarize it for you today in 3 key findings. 1, some level of concern for the environment can actually be useful and healthy when it leads to environmental action. And 2, compared to other children, EarthRangers members feel more concerned about the environment and more empowered to take action. So in short, the concern and anxiety kids are feeling around the environment and climate change is real and it's rational, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Kids who engage in positive environmental learning and action through our program and other programs are actually more concerned about the environment, but also more likely to take action and more optimistic that they could make a positive difference through their actions, whether it's planting a pollinator garden, cleaning up a local shoreline, or sorting the recycling at home. So taking these actions is really the key to helping kids manage their eco-anxiety. Another interesting thing the study found is that when children grow concerned about issues like climate change and are spurred to take environmental action, they also prompt their parents to feel more empowered and take action. We call this the pass-through effect. So our research revealed that not only are EarthRangers members significantly more empowered to act on the environmental issue, but their parents are as well. These findings led us to develop the 5 E's. It's a toolkit for parents and caregivers to open up a dialogue about environment-related fears and to help your kids take action to address it. So our first E is empathy. Make sure to give your kids the opportunity to discuss their concerns. Give them space to identify and express their feelings and their fears. The next E is education. Offer them opportunities to learn and discuss environmental issues and why they're happening. It's not going to be helpful to shield them from it or pretend that it's not a problem. The next E is environmental stewardship. So spend time outdoors, connect with nature, and take tangible actions together to help the environment. Number 4 is excitement. Make conservation learning and activities something for kids to look forward to, something fun and something positive. And then the last E is empowerment. So give kids ways to teach you and other adults how to protect nature. Make them the environmental leaders in your own household or in their school or in their community. Kids love being in charge of things and knowing things that adults don't. So making it their job to lead environmental initiatives in your house is a really effective way to involve the whole family. We have seen firsthand that this approach really results in kids who are more positive, more empowered, more likely to take real action. So for example, our members who we engage in tangible environmental action through our programs are significantly more likely to feel optimistic and capable of making a difference than non-members. They're also significantly more likely to practice sustainable behaviors in general. So the big takeaway here is that fears and concerns about our environment are real, but with the right support, so is their ability to act. So that's it for me. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about our programs and our research. If you're interested in learning more about our organization, eco-anxiety, or how we engage kids in conservation, you can visit our website at earthrangers.com or download the EarthRangers app to register for a free membership. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Christina, for bringing us full circle. It's really awesome to hear EarthRangers capitalizing on some of those things that were most inspiring for me as a kid growing up. When I was 7, my birthday party was a trip to the Narcissus snake dens here in Manitoba, and I'll never forget how seeing those garter snakes made me feel. It's the exact same wonder and curiosity that you describe. And in general, I'm inspired by by that wonder, that curiosity, the energy and positive perspective that youth are bringing to environmental issues, as well as their creativity and motivation in response. We need inspired youth and adults in combination with organizations like those that the speakers today are representing, who join NCC at the front lines of science, research, and engaging people in solutions. By understanding our natural world, together we are better positioned to tackle what's known as the dual crises of climate change and one of the greatest biodiversity losses the planet has ever seen. And so I'd like to take a moment then to discuss how we can address in particular that biodiversity loss. Today in Canada, there are 804 species that have been assessed as at risk. And a species at risk is a plant or animal species in danger of disappearing from the wild. They've been assessed and given a status of risk ranging from special concern to threatened, endangered, or being extinct. Like what we heard from our NatureTalks speakers today, fearing these species isn't the real scare, but one of them rather is the growing number of those at risk, which is truly frightening. And this begs the question then, how does the loss of a species affect us in the long term? Well, species, big and small, affect us in different ways. They can be a source of delight. They provide an opportunity for curiosity and wonder. Think of 12-year-old Evan holding a snake. We can't help but enjoy the world around us, but that connection goes even deeper than that. We as humans are inextricably linked to the health of our ecosystems, because when nature thrives, people thrive. However, once species are gone, they are indeed gone forever, and such losses can leave ecosystems out of balance, which may then lead to rapid deterioration. In some cases, another species can move in to fill the gap of an extinct species, but in many cases, the lost one is indeed irreplaceable, and the consequences of those losses can be unpredictable. So from the pollination of our foods, to pest control, to clean air and drinking water, we need species to keep things working well and in balance. So learning more about species loss, indeed, may be a downer, but the awesome thing is that there is hope, and it is real hope. You and I wouldn't be here today if we didn't have hope for what our community can do for nature in Canada. Together, we can play an actually active role in the survival of species, whether that looks like reading White Fang or Silver Wing to your family, to joining a Batwatch program, or empowering kids to become the conservation leaders of both today and tomorrow. There are plenty of meaningful ways to address the grounded fears of ecological crisis. And when it comes to species at risk, one of the big ways we can make a difference is by conserving the habitat they need to thrive. Species with habitat in well-managed conservation lands generally face fewer threats than those without. When we reduce these kinds of threats, we also reduce the risk of extinction for species at risk. And so then in time, actions like conservation, restoration of habitat, caring for lands, and raising awareness can collectively improve the status of species at risk, and eventually, hopefully, we'll see them shift into lower risk categories and hopefully be removed from the at-risk list. So what that work looks like here in Manitoba, NCC works to conserve the tallgrass prairie, an ecosystem which in itself is endangered. And among the tallgrass prairie's 28 species at risk is another nocturnal creature, the short-eared owl. Now, NCC's land protection and management of the tallgrass prairie ecosystem, as well as annual surveys done in collaboration with local residents, ensures that short-eared owls will continue to have vital nesting habitat going forward. Now, that's a major win and proof that owl species, even the spooky ones, are important. And there are examples like this to be inspired by all over Canada. So as a few examples here, Sage and Sparrow, an NCC project in the interior of British Columbia, is home to a full 22 species at risk. In Alberta, if we're thinking about cool canines, an active den of swift foxes, a species once locally extinct in Canada, was discovered on an NCC site in 2018. In Saskatchewan, acoustic surveys are being used to supplement an inventory of bat species found on NCC properties throughout the province, and to date we've documented the occurrence of all 8 species known to occur in Saskatchewan, including endangered little brown and northern long-eared bats. At the Stone Elvar property in Ontario on Pelee Island in Lake Erie, we have a full 29 species at risk, so islands doing cool things. And indeed, it doesn't take a lot of land either. In Quebec, NCC properties off the Pike River, totaling just under 2 hectares or 4.9 acres of land, have proven to be crucial areas for protection as they're used by endangered soft-shell turtle hatchlings. And lastly, in Newfoundland and Labrador, NCC staff are monitoring for bat presence. Our staff are indeed present, and have reason to believe that there are 2 listed species of bats using some of our properties on the coast, both the little brown, again, and northern long-eared bats. And so briefly then, that's just a sampling to demonstrate that there is great work being done to help species at risk and addressing that fear of their loss. To date, NCC has protected habitat for a full 236 of Canada's species at risk. And furthermore, these are also examples of what donations from folks like you and me can do. The conservation over time of real places and habitats conserved for us, for those that come after us, and for the wildlife that depend on them for survival. And so now I hope that some of your fears have been addressed and that you're feeling not fearful, but rather inspired and energized and ready to ask some questions of our speakers. So now is the time to hop into that Q&A feature in your browser or app and let us know who the question is for, and then provide a question as well. And then I will over time pass those along to our speakers. We're going to try and get through as many of those questions as time allows. But before we get going, and as you formulate your questions and put them in the chat, I'm going to pass on this question to all of our speakers. And we'll start with you, Victoria. Where and when did your passion for nature begin?
Well, that's a great question. I can't even remember, but I know as a young kid, while I may have had some fears myself for spiders and some other creatures, I just loved everything from the common and not native house sparrow that would come to my backyard, all the way up to wolves that I would just see on nature films. And so I love the nature shows, and I actually grew up in a suburb near Montreal that had a lot of development going on, and it was heart-wrenching to me to see whenever another lot had trees cleared to build another house. And I think that kind of really pushed my motivation to try to sort of do something to try to save the little spaces that were around.
Sweet. I think you're probably not alone in the saving the little spaces energy, so I can definitely appreciate it. How about you, Toby?
Yeah, for sure. So I think you covered a little bit of my origin story in the introduction there. So I would say my passion maybe started with meeting that bat at the age of 11. I was always interested in animals, but it was that connection with bats that gave me the realization that I could do something. So after watching bats in my local park, a few weeks later, I got to go out and help catch bats and see them up close and hold one. And although we should avoid touching bats with concerns over rabies, which we weren't quite as smart about back then. But the fact that I was able to do that and hold an animal in my hand and let it go and see it fly really stuck with me. And then to get involved with my local bat group, which was a volunteer group focused on bats, and actually do things and go survey them and contribute, and that sort of being able to take action, I think cemented that for me.
Sweet. Yeah, nothing quite like hands-on experience, hey? Yeah, we were just chatting about that. And so to wrap things up here with this first round, Christina, what's your origin story?
Probably not a particular moment, but I mean, ever since I can remember, I loved going outside and watching the ants do their work, and I would always be the kid picking up worms from the sidewalk and caterpillars and any other creepy crawling thing I could get my hand on. I was like the designated person in our house for spider removal. So I feel like I come about it honestly. I've just always had a love for creepy crawlies, and then I guess it was in university when I did a field course in primatology at a Madagascar, chasing lemurs through the jungle, and that just sort of solidified for me that I wanted to work in conservation and help make a difference for these animals. Sweet.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to hear stories that I resonate with, all these different elements. And one of the common threads, and a question we have here from Susan, speaking about home encounters, Toby, if you would like to touch on the idea of bat houses. So Susan asks, If I mount a bat house, will they actually use it? I have heard that they are not really that effective. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Susan, for the question. So bat houses can be effective, but they're probably not effective to the extent or in the way that everyone would like them to be. Bats certainly do use them, and I've seen plenty of bat houses that have bats in them. But they tend to work best, I'd say, more as a supplement rather than a new resource for the bats. And particularly when we look at endangered bats or how bats are at risk, it's not at the moment. At the moment, it's not roost availability that is a constraining factor for them. So they don't need more roosts. But where we put bat houses up in the vicinity of a roost, bats will tend to use that to supplement their roost. So what I've seen often is where there's a building or a house that has a large bat roost in it and people put bat houses up, the bats will use that sort of as an annex to the main roost. So if they need a quiet night away from the kids or something, they go hang out there, but they're still part of that larger colony. And so there's rarely, I think, harm in putting up bat houses, and they can be effective, but it's also, without knowing more about the environment that anyone is in, you have to sort of accept that it might not work. But even if it doesn't get used by bats, it's probably providing a good home for spiders and insects and other things. So.
Yeah, they also a pretty good opportunity for outreach as well. I know if you in the audience are looking for a resource to build one, Bat Conservation International has an awesome how to build a bat house kit. So if you want to get together with some friends and build a bat house, that's a good opportunity. I've got a tough one here for Victoria that I look forward to an answer from. Jennifer asks, would you please comment on the idea that we must kill wolves to save caribou?
Yes, this is a very challenging question, and I think a lot of biologists and managers who study and work with this issue struggle with it as well. So first off, I'm not a caribou biologist, but what I do know about the situation, and for those who aren't aware, mountain caribou, such that we find like in BC and a few parts of Alberta, they have been in decline for many years. The challenge is really that the reason for decline, which has been happening for decades, is due to habitat loss. Caribou require what we call old growth forest, but it's often not necessarily the huge, really big trees. It's sort of a different kind of your older, smaller boreal trees that are still kind of old growth. And that's also a lot of same habitat that has been used for forestry. So as usual, whenever we have a conflict between resources and conservation, resources are usually kind of winning out until the sort of last moment. So we have these situations where we have these caribou populations that are on the brink of being lost, and even just having a few calves getting predated upon by wolves or other predators can be a really big loss because they do not reproduce quickly. And so from a purely scientific numbers game in terms of reducing any loss as much as possible, I can understand where this argument comes from, but it's really inconsistent because in a lot of these cases, they are not reducing the populations of other carnivores, which are also predating upon caribou, such as, let's say, bears. So it's harder to kill bears because, of course, grizzly bears, you can't just go out and kill them when they're threatened themselves. And then cougars can be another issue as well. And so, it kind of gets to this question of like, well, are we just going to kill off all the predators? Are we just going to create sort of a big outdoor zoo? And the other thing that really bothers me the most is what is the end game here? Because in many cases, the forest is still not being protected. So the argument is we got to kill the predators so that there's time for the trees to grow back so that the caribou can survive. But if we're not adequately protecting the trees and doing the other things that are required, then we're killing wolves for nothing because we're going to lose those caribou anyway. So at the end of the day, society has to make a decision of how important are caribou to us and make the adequate decisions, and not just sort of use a cop out of wolves because they're easy to kill since they reproduce quickly, right?
Hmm.
So not a clear answer, but
Yeah, I mean, there really aren't always a lot of clear answers, but always good. Yeah, always good to hear the context and to recognize it's a much larger, interdependent story than just shooting the one thing that you're scared of. And speaking then of fears, Christina, I'll turn to you. So one of the questions we have here is that children already suffer from anxiety. Should we worry about introducing another thing, climate change among it, to be anxious about? And if we're going to be worrying about it, then what can we do to address adding that anxiety?
Very good question. I think the reality is kids already have this anxiety. Like it's inescapable hearing about forest fires and flooding and like all of the stuff that's going on in the world because of climate change. So really the best thing we can do is to open a dialogue about it, hear how our kids are feeling, validate those fears because they are real rational concerns, and then give them the tools to cope with them. In terms of what those tools are, I think like going back to the 5 E's, besides opening that dialogue is taking action. That's just really so important to feel like you're doing something, to feel like you're part of a community that's doing something. Just really helps us to feel less anxious and more empowered.
Yeah, I think that that's a perfect transition to kind of our last moments here today, because it is Halloween coming up this weekend, and we have hundreds of folks in the chat today. So that community is big, and so if you want to do something, start that action. Tell a friendly story about bats. Go hunt down a good book. White Fang is a classic worth your time. So if feeling inspired, then that is indeed all the time we have for questions today. If we didn't get to yours, feel free to shoot us an email at events@natureconservancy.ca. So as we close, thank you, Toby and the Toronto Zoo, Victoria, West and the University of Calgary, and Christina and EarthRangers for sharing your expertise and the work that you're leading to protect nature and inform the rest of us. So on behalf of the Nature Conservancy of Canada, thank you, audience, for joining us today. Perhaps this Halloween, you too can be an ambassador and a champion of misunderstood species. And if you're feeling compelled today to do something else for species at risk, check out Gifts of Canadian Nature. And with that, until we meet again.